Sickly fluorescent lights hummed over Trauma Bay 3, casting a pale green hue on the cracked linoleum. No one looked twice at Claire, the quiet night shift nurse holding a fresh IV bag. They just saw tired eyes and cheap scrubs. They didn't see the ghosts she left in Fallujah. Fluorescent bulbs above the nurse's station emitted a continuous, high-pitched whine that only Claire seemed to notice. It was 3:14 a.m. on a Tuesday, the hour when the emergency room of St. Jude settled into a stagnant, suffocating rhythm. The air always felt heavy at this time, thick with a cocktail of scents that had long ago permanently settled into the porous ceiling tiles. Industrial bleach, stale urine, the metallic tang of old coins, and the sour yeast of unwashed bodies. Claire leaned against the laminate counter, her forearms resting on the cold, faux wood surface. The cheap fabric of her navy scrubs chafed against her collarbone, a constant, dull irritation she had simply learned to tune out. She watched Dr. Gregory, the third-year resident, fumble with a central line kit across the hall in Bay 2. Gregory was sweating. A single drop hung precariously from the tip of his nose, catching the harsh overhead light before falling onto the sterile blue drape covering the patient's chest. The patient, a severely intoxicated man who had decided to test the structural integrity of a brick wall with his sedan, was tachycardic, his monitor beeping with an erratic, frantic urgency. Nobody in the room was moving with purpose. Sarah, the junior nurse, was frantically tearing through a supply cart, her breathing shallow and panicked. The respiratory therapist was looking at his watch. Claire felt a familiar, ugly coil of irritation tighten in her stomach. It wasn't heroics that drove her. It was an absolute intolerance for inefficiency. Pushing off the counter, her rubber-soled clogs squeaked sharply against the wax floor. She didn't run. Running caused panic. Running made people look at you. She walked with a measured, deliberate gait, sliding effortlessly into the chaotic space of Bay 2. She didn't ask for permission. She simply reached out, her fingers rough and deeply calloused hands that didn't match her soft, unassuming face, and intercepted the guide wire Gregory was blindly trying to thread. "You're fighting the angle, doctor," Claire said. Her voice was flat, devoid of the soothing, melodic customer service tone they taught in nursing school. It was gravelly, quiet, but it possessed a strange acoustic quality that cut straight through the clamor of the trauma bay. Gregory blinked, startled, his hands shaking slightly. He stepped back a half-inch, just enough to relinquish control. Claire didn't look at him. Her eyes were fixed on the insertion site. She adjusted the needle a fraction of a millimeter, felt the subtle, yielding pop of the vein wall through the plastic hub, and smoothly advanced the wire. No hesitation, no tremor. Just muscle memory so deeply ingrained it felt like a curse. "Wires in," she muttered, stepping back just as quickly as she had arrived, wiping a smear of betadine off her thumb. "Tape him down, Sarah, and get that heart rate under 100 before he throws a clot." Claire left the bay before they could thank her, retreating to the break room. The space was barely larger than a closet, dominated by a vending machine that hummed aggressively and a refrigerator that smelled faintly of rotting lettuce. She sank into a plastic chair that groaned under her weight, closing her eyes. She hated this. She hated the slow, agonizing drag of civilian trauma. Here, every minor laceration was a tragedy. Every broken bone was a crisis requiring a committee. She rubbed her right knee, feeling the thick, jagged scar tissue beneath the thin cotton of her scrub pants. It ached fiercely tonight, a deep, atmospheric throb that usually meant the barometric pressure was dropping. Or maybe it just remembered the sharp, jarring impact of the concrete in Ramadi. She pressed her thumbs into her temples. Her mind felt fragmented, split between two worlds that refused to reconcile. On the outside, she was Claire Davis, a 32-year-old spinster nurse who rarely spoke at staff meetings, brought store-bought cookies to potlucks, and never mentioned her past beyond a vague, "I spent some time overseas." She was invisible. She had engineered her life specifically to be invisible. But beneath the surface, the wiring was completely different. The civilian world felt muffled, as if she were walking underwater. She missed the sharp, terrifying clarity of a hot zone. She felt a profound, suffocating guilt for missing it. Missing the coppery stench of massive hemorrhage, the concussive thump of artillery that rattled your teeth in your skull. The absolute, stripped-down honesty of keeping a shattered human being alive with nothing but duct tape, combat gauze, and sheer, violent will. She poured a cup of coffee from the glass carafe. It was lukewarm and tasted like burnt cardboard and ash. She drank it anyway, welcoming the bitter shock to her palate. A radio crackled on the counter, the dispatcher's voice breaking through the static, announcing an incoming transport. Routine stuff. A slip and fall. Claire stared at her own reflection in the dark window pane of the break room. Her eyes looked hollow, ringed with shadows that no amount of sleep could erase. She wondered, not for the first time, how much longer she could keep pretending to be this person before the mask finally cracked and fell apart entirely. Vibrations hit the floorboards before the sound even reached the sliding glass doors of the ER. Claire felt it in her boots, a rhythmic, heavy thumping that made the lukewarm coffee in her styrofoam cup ripple in concentric circles. It wasn't a siren. Sirens wailed and pierced. This was a low, guttural, mechanical roar. Rotary wings. Claire froze, the cup halfway to her mouth. The hospital had a helipad on the roof for civilian medevac flights, but the pitch of these blades was entirely wrong. A civilian Bell 407 had a light, frantic chop. The sound vibrating through the foundation of St. Jude's was the deep, concussive whump-whump-whump of a UH-60 Black Hawk, and it wasn't landing on the roof. The sound was echoing off the pavement directly outside the ground floor ambulance bay. The double automatic doors blew open, safety mechanisms failing as they were forced apart. A violent gust of wind swept into the pristine lobby, carrying with it a distinct, overwhelming olfactory assault. In less than a second, the smell of hospital bleach was annihilated by the harsh odors of aviation fuel, hot asphalt, scorched Kevlar, and the undeniable metallic stench of fresh, catastrophic trauma. The lobby erupted into immediate chaos. Patients waiting with sprained ankles and earaches screamed as a half-dozen figures surged through the doors. They weren't paramedics. They were massive, heavily armored men clad in dust-caked tactical gear, moving with a terrifying, synchronized aggression. Plate carriers, night vision mounts flipped up on fast helmets, drop-leg holsters smeared with dirt, civilian nurses and orderlies scattered like startled birds, pressing themselves against the walls. Doctor Gregory froze entirely in the center of the hallway, a clipboard dropping from his hands to clatter loudly on the tiles. Claire did not freeze. Her heart rate, which usually hovered around a sluggish 60 beats per minute, spiked instantly. Yet, paradoxically, the crushing fog of the shift evaporated. Her vision tunneled, hyperfocusing. Her brain automatically categorized the intruders. 4 operators pulling security, sweeping the corners of the ER with the muzzles of their suppressed rifles pointed strictly at the floor. 2 more operators in the center, dragging a collapsible litter. "Clear the bay! Clear the goddamn bay!" a man bellowed. He was towering, his uniform stripped of rank or insignia, save for a blood-soaked infrared flag patch on his shoulder. His voice didn't crack with panic. It boomed with command. Claire stepped forward, her movements terrifyingly fluid. She bypassed Dr. Gregory, shoving his shoulder hard to move him out of the choke point. "Bay 1 is open. Move," she shouted, her voice suddenly matching the operator's volume, cutting through the rotor wash and the screaming. The lead operator locked eyes with her for a fraction of a second. He saw someone not backing down. Without a word, they hauled the litter into Trauma Bay 1. Claire followed them in, kicking the doorstop to wedge the heavy glass door open. She looked down at the litter. The casualty was a male, maybe 25, wearing shredded combat pants. His chest armor had been violently removed, revealing a torso that was a mangled ruin of torn flesh and bubbling blood. "What do we have?" Claire demanded, stepping right into the personal space of a massive soldier. trying to hold pressure on the wound. IED blast, secondary shrapnel. The lead operator growled, breathing heavily. Doc took a round to the neck on the exfil. We're flying blind. He's got a sucking chest wound and his pressure is tanking. We need a surgeon right now. Dr. Gregory finally stumbled into the room, pale and shaking. He looked at the gaping hole in the soldier's chest and the tactical gear surrounding him. "Oh my God," he whispered. We need to type and cross. We need an X-ray." "He doesn't have time for a fucking X-ray." The soldier holding pressure snapped, his eyes wild. The casualty gasped, a wet, horrifying gurgle escaping his lips. His chest heaved, but only one side rose. The other side remained sunken, blood frothing from the hole with every desperate attempt to pull air. Tension pneumothorax. His lung had collapsed, and trapped air was crushing his heart. Gregory was frozen, staring at the bubbling wound. "We need a chest tube set up. Sarah, page surgery." "No time," Claire said. The words slipped out of her mouth before she could stop them. The civilian mask didn't just slip. It shattered completely on the floor. She shoved past the towering operator, slamming her knee against the side of the gurney for leverage. She didn't look at Gregory. She reached blindly over her shoulder to the supply cart, her fingers bypassing the sterile chest tube kits and grabbing a large-bore 1-4 gauge intravenous catheter. "What are you doing?" Gregory shrieked. "You can't do that. You're a nurse." "Shut up and bag him," Claire snarled, a vicious, feral edge to her voice that made the resident physically recoil. She didn't use alcohol swabs. She didn't drape the area. She slapped her left hand against the soldier's bloody collarbone, finding the second intercostal space at the mid-clavicular line by pure, unadulterated touch. The anatomy was second nature. The lead operator grabbed her wrist, his grip like a vice. "Who the hell are you?" he demanded. Claire didn't look up at him. She stared at the casualty's cyanotic lips. She twisted her wrist violently, breaking the soldier's grip with a specialized close-quarters grappling technique that made the massive man stumble back in shock. "I'm the one keeping your boy alive, Sergeant. Now back the fuck off," she hissed. Before anyone could stop her, Claire drove the 1-4 gauge needle straight down into the casualty's chest. A sharp, audible hiss of pressurized air escaped the catheter, immediately followed by a spray of atomized blood that coated Claire's cheek and the front of her cheap navy scrubs. The casualty's chest suddenly rose. The erratic, dying beep of the heart monitor instantly steadied, picking up a stronger, regular rhythm. The trauma bay fell dead silent, save for the rhythmic beeping of the monitor and the distant thrum of the helicopter rotors outside. The operators stared at her, their weapons lowered, their eyes wide. They didn't see a quiet night shift nurse anymore. They saw the aggressive, flawless violence of action. They recognized one of their own. Claire pulled the needle out, leaving the plastic catheter in place to vent the chest, her breathing finally matching the adrenaline surging through her veins. She wiped the blood off her cheek with the back of a trembling, calloused hand, realizing with a sinking, terrifying clarity that there was no going back to the quiet life now. Shock paralyzed the trauma bay. For 3 agonizing seconds, the only sound was the wet, rhythmic hiss of trapped air escaping the plastic hub protruding from the soldier's chest. The erratic alarms on the cardiac monitor gradually silenced, replaced by the steady, reassuring beep of a stabilizing heart rate. Claire did not freeze to admire her work. Her hands were already moving. The civilian mask was gone, discarded on the floor somewhere between the break room and the gurney. She was operating on a purely autonomic nervous system, driven by muscle memory, forged in dirt and darkness. "Sarah," Claire barked, her voice devoid of any warmth. "I need a 36 French chest tube kit, a scalpel with a 10 blade, and heavy silk sutures. Move." Sarah, pressed flat against the wall, blinked rapidly, her mouth opening and closing like a landed fish. She couldn't process the sudden, violent shift in the quiet nurse who usually brought store-bought donuts on Fridays. "Now, Sarah," Claire snapped, the volume cracking like a whip in the confined space. The junior nurse scrambled toward the sterile supply carts, her hands shaking so violently she dropped 2 plastic packages before finally gripping the right one. Dr. Gregory finally found his voice. It was thin, reedy, and laced with absolute panic. You pierced the pleural cavity. You don't have the authority. If you hit the subclavian artery, if I didn't decompress him, he'd be dead in 60 seconds from obstructive shock, Claire interrupted, not even looking at the resident. She pressed 2 fingers to the casualty's carotid artery, feeling the pulse strengthen. It was fast, thready, but it was there. He needs definitive airway control. Gregory, stop hyperventilating and tube him. Push 20 of etomidate and 100 of succinylcholine. Do your job. Gregory hesitated, staring at the intimidating wall of heavily armed men surrounding the bed. The towering lead operator, the one Claire had shoved, stepped closer to the resident. His gear was covered in a thick layer of fine, tan dust that smelled distinctly of pulverized concrete and cordite. "Doc," the operator rumbled, his voice dangerously low. "The lady gave you an order. I highly suggest you follow it." Gregory swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing frantically. He scrambled to the head of the bed, grabbing a laryngoscope with trembling hands. Claire turned her attention back to the soldier on the table. His skin was the color of dirty wax. The temporary needle decompression was buying them minutes, but the lung was still severely compromised. She ripped open the chest tube tray Sarah pushed onto the edge of the mattress. There was no time for full sterile drapes. She grabbed a bottle of betadine and poured it directly over the soldier's ribcage, the dark brown liquid mixing violently with the bright red arterial blood pooling on his skin. The metallic scent of rust collided with the sharp, chemical tang of iodine. It was a smell that immediately transported her back to a sweltering surgical tent in Helmand, a sensory flashback so intense she felt a phantom bead of sweat roll down her spine. She grabbed the scalpel. "Hold him down," she ordered the operators. 2 of the massive men didn't question her. They stepped forward, pinning the casualty's shoulders and hips to the mattress. They recognized the tone. It was the absolute, unquestionable authority of a combat medic in the shit. Rank didn't matter here. Competence was the only currency. Claire pressed the blade into the skin just above the 5th rib, making a clean, 2-inch horizontal incision. The casualty bucked, a primitive, unconscious reaction to the pain. But the operators held him completely rigid. Claire dropped the scalpel and plunged her index finger directly into the bloody incision, bluntly dissecting the muscle tissue. She felt the cartilage, found the top of the rib, and pushed through the pleura with a sickening wet pop. A sudden rush of dark blood and trapped air bubbled over her knuckles, hot and sticky. She didn't flinch. She grabbed the heavy plastic chest tube with her other hand and guided it along her finger, sliding it deep into the chest cavity. The result was instantaneous. A massive volume of blood dumped through the tube, splashing loudly into the plastic collection canister on the floor. The casualty's good lung expanded fully. The awful, wet gurgling stopped. "Tube is secured," Gregory gasped from the head of the bed, taping the endotracheal tube in place. His scrub top was soaked in sweat. "Suture," Claire demanded, holding out a bloody hand. Sarah slapped the needle driver into her palm. Claire threw 3 rapid, flawless knots to secure the heavy plastic tube to the soldier's skin, wrapping the silk tightly. The double doors of the trauma bay crashed open again. Dr. Caldwell, the attending trauma surgeon, burst in, followed by 2 surgical residents. Caldwell took one look at the heavily armed men, the blood-soaked floor, the chest tube draining a liter of blood, and the quiet night shift nurse standing over it all with bloody hands. "What the hell is going on in my ER?" Caldwell demanded. Claire stepped back, peeling off her latex gloves. The rubber snapped loudly in the sudden quiet. She dropped them into a biohazard bin. The adrenaline was beginning to recede, leaving behind a cold, sharp ache in her rebuilt knee. Tension pneumo, secondary to shrapnel, decompressed, chest tube placed, draining 800 cc's, Claire reported, her voice dropping back into its usual, flat civilian register. Airway secured. He needs an oar. Now, Caldwell looked at the chest tube. It was perfectly placed. He looked at Gregory, who was shaking his head in silent denial. Then, Caldwell looked at Claire, his eyes narrowing in confusion. The lead operator stepped between the surgeon and the bed. "You heard her, Doc. Get my guy to surgery." As the surgical team frantically unlocked the gurney and wheeled the casualty out of the bay, the operators fell in line behind them, a protective, armored escort. The lead operator lingered for a fraction of a second. He turned his head, his eyes locking onto Claire. He didn't say a word. He just gave her a slow, deliberate nod, a gesture of profound, mutual recognition, before turning and disappearing down the hallway. Claire stood alone in the center of the ruined trauma bay. The floor was slick with betadine and bodily fluids. The sterile wrappers were scattered like dead leaves. She looked down at her cheap navy scrubs. They were ruined. She felt a tremor start in her fingers, the inevitable, violent physiological crash that always followed the high. She clenched her fists, hiding the shake, and walked toward the staff locker rooms without looking at the shocked civilian faces staring at her from the hallway. The water from the scrub sink was freezing. Claire let it run over her forearms, watching the pale pink foam swirl down the stainless steel drain. She scrubbed aggressively with a harsh, bristled sponge, digging into the cuticles and the deep calluses on her palms. The smell of the hospital's cheap antibacterial soap couldn't entirely mask the lingering copper scent that had seeped into her pores. Her hands were shaking violently now. This was the part she always hated. In the moment, the body was a machine, fueled by cortisol and instinct. But afterward, in the quiet, the bill always came due. Her breath hitched, catching in her throat as a wave of intense nausea rolled over her. She gripped the edges of the metal sink, bowing her head, closing her eyes against the harsh glare of the fluorescent tube light above the mirror. She had compromised everything. 4 years of careful, meticulous blending in. 4 years of biting her tongue during pointless staff meetings, of pretending she didn't know how to field strip a rifle, of acting like a spilled bedpan was an emergency. She had built a perfect, boring little life to hide the fractured pieces of herself, and she had blown it all to hell in less than 5 minutes. The locker room door creaked open, the heavy hinges groaning. Claire didn't turn around. She recognized the heavy, deliberate tread of tactical boots on the linoleum. It wasn't the frantic, squeaking scuff of a nurse. It was the measured, balanced step of a predator. "You missed a spot," a deep voice rumbled. Claire reached for a rough paper towel, drying her hands meticulously before turning around. The lead operator was standing just inside the doorway. He had removed his helmet, revealing close-cropped, graying hair and a face deeply lined by sun and stress. He looked utterly out of place amongst the rows of dented gray lockers and motivational nursing posters. "You shouldn't be in here," Claire said. Her voice was steady, the tremor confined entirely to her hands, which she shoved deep into the pockets of her scrub jacket. "Caldwell says O'Connor is going to make it," the operator said, ignoring her statement completely. "Said the chest tube placement was textbook. Saved his life." "Good," Claire replied flatly. "You can leave now." The man didn't move. He leaned a broad shoulder against the cinder block wall, crossing his arms over his plate carrier. "I've been in the teams a long time. I know every medic in the Tier 1 rotation. I know the guys who taught the guys who taught you." He paused, his dark eyes analyzing her with uncomfortable precision. "You didn't learn that wrist lock at a self-defense seminar. And you sure as hell didn't learn to blindly dart a chest under duress in nursing school. That was JSOC. That was Night Stalker shit." Claire stared at him. She felt the defensive walls snapping into place, thick and impenetrable. "I'm a registered nurse, Sergeant. I don't know what acronyms you're throwing around." The operator smiled faintly, a grim, knowing expression. "It's Grimes," he said. "And you don't have to lie to me. I know a ghost when I see one." He reached into a pouch on his vest and pulled out a small, heavy object. He tossed it underhand. Claire caught it purely on reflex. She opened her palm. It was a matte black challenge coin, entirely devoid of unit insignias or identifying markers, save for a single, deeply engraved Roman numeral. "A lot of our guys come back and try to play normal," Grimes said quietly, the gravel in his voice softening. "They buy a house, they mow the lawn, they get a job where they don't have to carry a weapon. But it never really works, does it? The wiring is permanent. You can put a wolf in a dog park, but it's still going to look at the other dogs like meat when it gets hungry." Claire looked down at the heavy coin in her hand. The cold metal felt grounding. It felt like reality. "I'm not a wolf," she whispered, staring at the floor. "I'm just tired." "You look pretty awakened, Bay-1," Grimes countered softly. He pushed off the wall, walking slowly toward the door. He stopped with his hand on the handle. "We're spinning up for another rotation in 3 months. O'Connor's slot is empty. If you get tired of pretending to care about sprained ankles, you know how to find us." He didn't wait for a response. He pushed the door open and walked out, leaving the heavy silence to settle back over the room. Claire stood alone for a long time. She felt the raised edges of the coin with her thumb. She walked over to her locker, dialed the combination, and pulled the metal door open. Her civilian clothes hung there, a beige cardigan, sensible slacks, comfortable flats. The uniform of Claire Davis, quiet spinster nurse. It looked like a costume. A distant, heavy thumping began to vibrate through the foundation of the hospital. The Black Hawk was spinning up its rotors on the asphalt outside. Claire closed her eyes, listening to the deep, concussive rhythm. It didn't sound chaotic anymore. It sounded like a heartbeat. She slipped the heavy black coin into the pocket of her scrub jacket. She didn't throw it away. She didn't put it in her bag to take home. She kept it on her. Taking a deep breath, Claire pushed the locker room door open and walked back out into the bright, buzzing hallway of the emergency department. The nurses at the central station stopped talking as she approached. "Doctor," Gregory looked down at his charts, suddenly terrified of making eye contact. They were looking at her as if she were an alien, a dangerous, unpredictable thing that had somehow snuck into their safe, sterile world. For 4 years, that look would have terrified her. It would have sent her spiraling into a panic, desperate to reassure them, to shrink back into the shadows and prove she was harmless. But as Claire walked past the nurse's station, feeling the heavy weight of the coin in her pocket and the sharp, familiar ache in her rebuilt knee, she didn't lower her eyes. She didn't shrink. She grabbed a fresh clipboard from the counter, her movements precise and deliberate. "Bay 3 is waiting on a laceration repair," Claire said loudly, her voice cutting through the tense silence of the room. She looked directly at Dr. Gregory, her eyes hard and entirely unapologetic. "Let's go, doctor. We don't have all night." No one argued. No one hesitated. Claire walked into the trauma bay, the civilian mask finally gone for good, leaving only the sharp, unyielding reality of exactly who she was beneath. Did Claire's explosive transition from quiet nurse to elite operator keep you on the edge of your seat? The scars of the past never truly fade, and sometimes the most dangerous heroes are hiding in plain sight. If you love this intense, gritty story of hidden identity and raw survival, hit that like button. Don't forget to share this video with fellow thriller fans and subscribe to the channel for more deeply human, action-packed stories every week. Stay frosty.
Hi, my name is Jeffrey Williams, the owner and manager of Second Ember Reborn. After watching the video, no one suspected the Karma nurse was a Black Ops medic until the army arrived. I'd really like to know what you think. How did this story make you feel? What stayed with me was the idea that we never really know everything about the people around us. Claire seemed quiet and ordinary on the surface, yet when a crisis arrived, her experience and composure made all the difference. It's a reminder that strength doesn't always announce itself. It's often hidden behind everyday routines. Do you think Claire made the right choice by stepping forward and revealing who she truly was? And have you ever met someone whose abilities surprised you once you got to know them better? If this story resonated with you, I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments. And if you enjoy these kinds of character-driven stories, feel free to like and subscribe if you think it's worth it.